The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence of Kandahar airfield like a serrated blade. Tower, this is Viper 1-1. We have multiple aircraft down. Repeat, multiple aircraft down. The voice belonged to Colonel Marcus Thorne, and for the first time in his 23-year career, uncertainty bled through his professional composure. In the control tower, Air Traffic Controller Staff Sergeant Riley Martinez leaned forward, her coffee growing cold as she processed the impossible transmission. 3 F-16 Fighting Falcons had vanished from radar screens in the span of 4 minutes. No mayday calls, no distress signals, just 3 green blips dissolving into electronic void over the mountainous terrain of eastern Afghanistan. The mission had been routine, a high-altitude reconnaissance sweep of suspected Taliban supply routes. Now, $150 million worth of American air superiority had simply evaporated into the Hindu Kush's unforgiving peaks. What haunted Martinez wasn't the loss of aircraft. Mechanical failures happened, even to the military's most advanced fighters. What chilled her blood was the final transmission from Captain Derek Bulldog Patterson, lead pilot of the formation. "What the hell is that thing? It's not showing on." Then silence. Complete, absolute silence that stretched across the radio frequencies like a shroud. The search and rescue operation launched at first light revealed wreckage scattered across 3 separate valleys, each crash site separated by impossible distances. The debris patterns defied explanation. These weren't controlled descents or emergency landings. The F-16s had been systematically destroyed in midair, their twisted remains telling stories that made seasoned crash investigators exchange worried glances and speak in hushed tones. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the single piece of evidence that didn't fit the narrative: a helmet-mounted camera from Bulldog's aircraft, recovered intact despite the catastrophic destruction surrounding it. The final frame showed something that made Pentagon analysts question their own eyes: a single A-64 Apache attack helicopter, call sign Reaper 6, engaging and destroying 3 of America's premier multi-role fighters in aerial combat that should have been impossible. The Apache pilot's identity remained classified, buried behind layers of military bureaucracy and redacted files. But whispers traveled through the corridors of power, carrying a name that some recognized and others feared: Captain Zara Reaper Volkov, a pilot whose reputation preceded her like the shadow of death itself. The question that kept senior officers awake wasn't how she had accomplished the impossible. It was why she had turned her weapons against her own forces. The answer to that question would unravel a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of military command and challenge everything they thought they knew about loyalty, betrayal, and the true cost of war. Captain Zara Volkov had been flying Apache helicopters for 8 years, but her colleagues still treated her like an outsider. Part of it was gender. Attack helicopter pilots remained an overwhelmingly male profession, despite official policies promoting equality. Part of it was her unconventional background. Unlike most military aviators who followed predictable paths through flight school and progressive aircraft assignments, Volkov had earned her wings through necessity rather than ambition. Born in Sarajevo during the Yugoslav wars, she had witnessed her city torn apart by ethnic violence and international indifference. Her family had fled to America when she was 12, refugees seeking sanctuary in a country that promised opportunity to those willing to serve. Volkov had enlisted immediately after high school, driven not by patriotism, but by a desperate hunger to master the machines that had once terrorized her childhood, to transform from victim to apex predator. Her Apache, tail number 605497, bore the subdued markings of the 1st Battalion, 227th Aviation Regiment. But those who knew looked for the small details that marked it as different: the slightly modified targeting system, the non-standard communications array, and the personal touch that regulations technically prohibited: a small Orthodox cross painted beneath the pilot's window, barely visible unless you knew where to look. The cross wasn't just decoration. It was a reminder of her younger brother Mikhail, killed by helicopter gunfire during the siege of Sarajevo. Every time Volkov climbed into her Apache's cockpit, she carried that memory with her, transforming grief into precision, loss into lethality. Her fellow pilots nicknamed her Reaper, partly for her exceptional kill ratio against Taliban forces, but mostly because of the way she seemed to commune with death itself. Never reckless, never emotional, but absolutely relentless when the situation demanded violence. Lieutenant Colonel James Hammer Morrison, her squadron commander, had tried multiple times to have her transferred to a desk job. Not because she was incompetent, quite the opposite. Volkov's tactical acumen and technical skills were undeniable, but she possessed a quality that made career military officers uncomfortable. She thought for herself. She questioned orders that didn't make tactical sense, challenged intelligence assessments that seemed flawed, and worst of all, she was usually right. The morning of the F-16 incident, Morrison had called her into his office for what he termed a professional development discussion. In reality, it was an attempt to bring her into line with military hierarchy and acceptable behavior patterns. He sat behind his desk, service ribbons arranged in perfect rows on his chest, and delivered what amounted to an ultimatum wrapped in bureaucratic language. "Captain, your performance evaluations consistently note your technical proficiency," Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. "However, there are concerns about your adherence to command structure and your tendency to interpret orders creatively." He paused, allowing the criticism to settle. "The Army values initiative, but it values discipline more. I need to know that when I give you an order, you'll execute it without question or modification." Volkov listened without expression, her dark eyes fixed on a point just over Morrison's shoulder where a framed photograph showed him shaking hands with a Pentagon official she didn't recognize. When he finished speaking, she offered a response that was technically correct but carried undertones of defiance. "Sir, I've always completed my assigned missions within acceptable parameters." The careful phrasing wasn't accidental. It left room for interpretation while avoiding direct insubordination. Morrison sensed the subtext but couldn't pin down specifics for disciplinary action. This was Volkov's particular skill, threading the needle between competence and compliance, never quite crossing lines that would justify serious consequences. As she left his office, neither of them realized they were having their final conversation as members of the same military organization. Events were already in motion that would transform Captain Zara, Reaper, Volkov from problem subordinate to something far more dangerous. The mission briefing that would change everything took place in a sterile conference room deep within Kandahar's command complex. Major General Patricia Hawkins, Deputy Commander of Coalition Air Operations, stood before a wall-mounted display showing satellite imagery of the target area. Her audience consisted of 12 pilots from various squadrons, including the 3 F-16 pilots who would be dead within 18 hours. "Gentlemen, ladies," Hawkins began, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Operation Copper Mountain represents a significant escalation in our counterinsurgency efforts. Intelligence indicates a high-value target meeting occurring tomorrow at these coordinates." She gestured toward a complex of buildings nestled in a valley 40 kilometers northeast of Kandahar. "The target is Khalid al-Masri, senior Taliban commander responsible for IED networks across 3 provinces." Captain Patterson raised his hand. "Ma'am, what's the threat assessment for air defenses in the target area?" His question was professional, focusing on the tactical challenges his F-16 would face during the strike mission. "Minimal," Hawkins replied without hesitation. "Latest intelligence suggests man-portable air defense systems only, no sophisticated radar-guided threats. Your primary concern will be terrain masking and civilian casualty avoidance." She clicked to the next slide, showing approach routes and target timing. "Captain Volkov, your Apache will provide close air support and battle damage assessment. The F-16s will deliver the primary strike package." This was where the briefing took an unusual turn. Normally, attack helicopters and fighter jets operated in carefully coordinated but separate roles. Helicopters for close support and precision engagement, fighters for rapid strike missions against high-value targets. But this mission required unprecedented coordination between aircraft with vastly different capabilities and operating parameters. Volkov studied the target imagery with the intensity she brought to all tactical problems. Something felt wrong. The building complex showed signs of recent construction and modification, including what appeared to be hardened positions and possible anti-aircraft emplacements. More troubling, the intelligence assessment seemed almost deliberately vague about enemy capabilities and local force disposition. "Ma'am," Volkov said, her voice cutting through the routine briefing rhythm. "The satellite imagery shows recent excavation around the target buildings. That's consistent with prepared defensive positions. Are we certain about the threat assessment?" Her question hung in the air like an accusation, challenging not just the intelligence but the competence of those who had prepared it. Hawkins's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Captain, intelligence assessment is above your pay grade. Your job is to execute the mission as briefed, not to second-guess analysts with access to information you don't possess." The rebuke was sharp enough to make other pilots shift uncomfortably in their chairs. But Volkov wasn't finished. "With respect, ma'am, if I'm providing close air support, I need to understand the threat environment. My aircraft's survivability depends on accurate intelligence, and these images suggest. Your aircraft's survivability depends on following orders and maintaining proper formation discipline. With the strike package," Hawkins interrupted, "the F-16s will neutralize any significant threats before you're cleared into the target area. Captain Patterson and his flight have the training and equipment to handle whatever defenses might be present." The dismissal was clear, but it revealed something more troubling: a fundamental misunderstanding of how different aircraft systems worked and their relative vulnerabilities. F-16s, despite their advanced avionics and speed, were actually more vulnerable to certain types of ground-based threats than the slower but more heavily armored Apache. Hawkins's confidence seemed based more on aircraft prestige than tactical reality. As the briefing concluded and pilots filed out to prepare their aircraft, Volkov lingered, studying the imagery one final time. Her instincts, honed by years of combat experience, screamed warnings that official intelligence chose to ignore. She had learned to trust those instincts. They had kept her alive through situations that killed other pilots. But this time, following her tactical judgment would put her in direct conflict with military authority and challenge the chain of command she had sworn to obey. The pre-flight inspection of Apache 605497 revealed the methodical precision that characterized everything about Captain Volkov's approach to military aviation. Unlike many pilots who relied heavily on crew chiefs and maintenance personnel, she personally examined every critical system, checking hydraulic fluid levels, inspecting rotor blade attachment points, and verifying ammunition loading. Her co-pilot and gunner, Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Tango Rodriguez, had learned to appreciate this thoroughness even when it delayed their departure. "Captain, you realize the crew chief already checked all this stuff, right?" Rodriguez said as Volkov examined the chain gun ammunition feed mechanism for the third time. His tone was light, but underneath lay genuine curiosity about her obsessive attention to mechanical details. "Rodriguez, the crew chief doesn't get shot at if something breaks," Volkov replied without looking up from her inspection. "I do, so I check everything myself." She moved to the Hellfire missile hardpoints, visually confirming proper attachment and electrical connections. Besides, maintenance personnel see what they expect to see. Combat pilots learn to see what's actually there. This philosophy extended beyond aircraft maintenance to every aspect of mission planning and execution. While other pilots relied primarily on official briefings and standard operating procedures, Volkov maintained her own intelligence files, compiled from direct observation, conversations with ground forces, and careful analysis of previous mission outcomes. She had identified patterns in enemy behavior that official intelligence consistently missed or ignored. The Hellfire missiles mounted on her Apache stub wings weren't standard loadout for the briefed mission profile. Normal close air support configurations emphasized 30 cannon ammunition and rockets for engaging personnel and light vehicles. But Volkov had specifically requested anti-tank variants of the Hellfire, ostensibly for potential armored targets that intelligence assessments deemed unlikely. Her real motivation was different. She suspected the mission might encounter threats that required precision engagement at extended range. "Captain," Rodriguez said as they completed the final systems check, "I've been thinking about those satellite photos from the briefing. Did you notice the vehicle tracks around the target buildings?" He had served as her gunner for 14 months, long enough to recognize when she was processing tactical problems that others had overlooked. "What kind of tracks?" Volkov asked, though she had already identified the same evidence during her detailed examination of the imagery. "Heavy vehicles, probably trucks, but the pattern was wrong for routine resupply. More like they were positioning equipment or supplies for defensive operations." Rodriguez paused, then voiced the concern they both shared. "Ma'am, what if the intelligence assessment is wrong? What if we're flying into something a lot worse than they think?" This was the question that had kept Volkov awake the previous night. Military intelligence had a disturbing tendency toward optimistic assessments, particularly when those assessments supported predetermined operational plans. Commanders wanted actionable intelligence that justified aggressive missions against high-value targets. Intelligence analysts, conscious of career implications, often provided exactly what commanders wanted to hear rather than what tactical realities suggested. "Rodriguez, we've been flying together long enough for you to know I don't ignore my instincts," Volkov said as she settled into the pilot's seat and began the startup sequence. "But we also don't ignore lawful orders from superior officers. We'll execute the mission as briefed, but we'll be ready for contingencies that weren't included in the official threat assessment." The Apache's twin turboshaft engines wound up with their characteristic whine, drowning out further conversation until they established intercom communication. As Volkov lifted off from Kandahar's flight line, she could see the 3 F-16s already airborne, forming up at higher altitude for the transit to the target area. Captain Patterson's voice came across the radio, professional and confident. "Reaper 6, Viper 11 has visual on your aircraft. We're proceeding to Waypoint Alpha as briefed." But even as she acknowledged the transmission and settled into formation, Volkov was studying the terrain ahead with the intensity of someone who expected trouble. Her hands moved across the Apache's controls with unconscious familiarity, while her mind calculated angles, distances, and escape routes that might become necessary if the mission went wrong. She had no way of knowing that within the next 4 hours, those calculations would mean the difference between survival and becoming another casualty statistic in America's longest war. The flight to the target area passed through some of Afghanistan's most unforgiving terrain, jagged peaks that rose above 15,000 feet, separated by valleys so narrow and deep that radar coverage became sporadic and radio communications unreliable. For the F-16 pilots flying at 25,000 feet, the landscape below looked like a geological abstraction, all brown and gray angles without human scale. But for Volkov, flying her Apache at 500 feet above ground level, every ridge and valley represented potential threats or opportunities. "Reaper 6, Viper 11, Patterson's voice crackled through the radio. "We're beginning our descent to attack altitude. Confirm you're holding at the designated standoff position." The F-16s needed to complete their high-speed strike runs before the slower Apache could safely enter the target area, a coordination challenge that required precise timing and flawless communication. "Viper 11, Reaper 6 is established at standoff position, maintaining visual on target area," Volkov responded. Through her helmet-mounted display, She could see the building complex that housed their objective, still several kilometers away but clearly visible through the Apache's advanced targeting systems. What she saw there made her blood run cold. The intelligence briefing had described a small compound with minimal security, perhaps a dozen Taliban fighters providing basic protection for the high-value target meeting. Instead, Volkov's thermal imaging revealed a heavily fortified position with what appeared to be at least 40 personnel in defensive positions around the buildings. More troubling, she could identify several vehicle-mounted weapons systems that definitely weren't man-portable air defense missiles. Viper 1-1, Reaper 6, she transmitted, knowing that her next words would be controversial. I'm seeing significantly more activity than briefed. Recommend aborting primary approach and reassessing threat picture. The response came not from Patterson but from the mission controller at Kandahar. Reaper 6, Control. You are not authorized to modify mission parameters based on visual assessment. Viper flight is cleared for immediate attack run as briefed. This was the moment when years of military training collided with tactical instinct and personal survival. Volkov knew that questioning orders during active operations could end her career, but she also knew that sending 3 F-16s into what looked like a prepared ambush would likely kill Patterson and his wingmen. Her finger hovered over the radio transmit button as she wrestled with a decision that would define the rest of her military service. Control, Reaper 6, she finally transmitted. Confirmed visual on multiple vehicle-mounted systems not consistent with briefed threat assessment. Strongly recommend immediate mission abort and detailed reconnaissance before proceeding with strike package. The radio fell silent for several seconds, an eternity in combat operations where timing measured in seconds could determine mission success or catastrophic failure. When Control finally responded, the voice carried unmistakable irritation. Reaper 6, Control. Execute mission as briefed. Viper flight is cleared hot on primary target. Through her targeting system, Volkov watched Patterson's F-16 begin its attack run, diving toward the target complex at nearly 400 miles per hour. She could see what he couldn't: multiple surface-to-air missile systems tracking his approach, preparing to engage an aircraft whose pilot believed he was attacking a lightly defended compound. In that moment, she made a decision that would transform her from loyal military officer to something else entirely. Viper 1-1, Reaper 6, she transmitted on the emergency frequency, knowing that her next words constituted direct insubordination. Break off attack run immediately. You have multiple SAM sites tracking your approach. This is not the target that was briefed. Her voice carried absolute conviction, the authority of someone who had identified mortal danger and was willing to risk everything to prevent unnecessary death. Patterson's response revealed both his professionalism and his growing confusion. Reaper 6, say again. Control has cleared us hot on target. Viper 1-1, I'm painting 3 SA-11 systems with active radar locks on your aircraft. Volkov lied smoothly, knowing that the fictitious surface-to-air missiles would force Patterson to abort his attack run. Recommend immediate defensive maneuvering and egress from target area. The lie bought precious seconds, but it also sealed her fate as a military officer. She had deliberately provided false tactical information to abort an authorized mission, a court-martial offense that could result in prison time and dishonorable discharge. But as she watched Patterson pull out of his attack run and begin defensive maneuvering, she felt no regret. Sometimes loyalty to fellow warriors trumped loyalty to abstract military hierarchy. What happened next would haunt Pentagon analysts for months and transform Captain Zara Volkov from problem subordinate to America's most wanted fugitive. The surface-to-air missiles that she had invented to save Patterson's life suddenly became terrifyingly real. The first missile launch came from a position that intelligence assessments had completely missed: a mobile SA-11 system concealed in a dried riverbed nearly 2 kilometers from the primary target. Volkov saw the distinctive smoke trail rising toward Patterson's F-16 and felt her stomach drop as she realized her fictional warning had become prophetic reality. The missile seeker head locked onto the F-16's heat signature, accelerating to Mach 3 in pursuit of an aircraft, whose pilot was still processing the impossible transition from routine strike mission to life-or-death evasion. Viper 1-1 missile launch, Volkov screamed into her radio, abandoning all pretense of proper communication protocol. Sam inbound from your 8 o'clock low, recommend immediate chaff and flare deployment. Patterson's training took over, his F-16 suddenly blooming with countermeasures as he pulled maximum G-forces in a desperate attempt to break the missile's lock. For a moment, it seemed like the evasive maneuvers might work. The SA-11 wavered slightly as it sorted through chaff clouds and thermal decoys. But Soviet-era surface-to-air missiles were designed to kill American fighters, and this particular weapon had been upgraded with modern guidance systems that made it far more lethal than intelligence assessments suggested. The explosion transformed Patterson's F-16 into an expanding ball of aluminum fragments and burning jet fuel. No ejection seat activation, no final radio transmission, just the sudden absence of a green blip on radar screens and the horrifying realization that American intelligence had failed catastrophically. Volkov watched through her targeting system as debris rained down across several square kilometers of mountainous terrain, each piece representing the violent death of a pilot she had tried unsuccessfully to save. "Control, Reaper 6, she transmitted, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around the target area. Viper 1-1 is down. Repeat, Viper 1-1 has been shot down by surface-to-air missile. Multiple SAM sites active in target area. Recommend immediate abort for remaining aircraft." But the nightmare was just beginning. Even as Volkov transmitted her warning, she could see additional missile launches targeting the remaining 2 F-16s in Patterson's flight. The Taliban, or whoever was operating those sophisticated air defense systems, had prepared a coordinated ambush designed to destroy American air assets. Intelligence had walked 3 fighter jets and an attack helicopter directly into what amounted to an aerial killing field. Captain Sarah Phoenix Chen, Patterson's wingman, had better luck with her evasive maneuvering. Her F-16 managed to avoid the first missile through a combination of electronic countermeasures and violent defensive flying, but the effort left her aircraft low on fuel and separated from the remaining member of the flight. Worse, the defensive maneuvering had carried her directly over secondary defensive positions that intelligence hadn't identified. "Phoenix 2-1, Reaper 6, Volkov transmitted, trying to provide tactical guidance to a pilot who was fighting for her life in an environment none of them had expected. "You have multiple MANPADS signatures north and east of your position. Recommend immediate egress on heading 270. Chen's response came through heavy breathing as she fought G-forces and aircraft controls simultaneously. "Reaper 6, Phoenix 2-1. I'm showing multiple missile launches from surface positions. This is definitely not what we were briefed for." The admission contained layers of meaning that went far beyond tactical assessment. Chen was acknowledging what all the surviving pilots now understood. They had been sent into combat based on intelligence that was either criminally incompetent or deliberately falsified. The distinction mattered for post-mission analysis, but right now survival took precedence over determining blame. Volkov watched Chen's F-16 successfully evade 2 man-portable missiles through a combination of flares and low-altitude maneuvering that pushed both aircraft and pilot to their absolute limits. But success created its own problems. Chen's fighter was now flying at extremely low altitude over terrain that offered no room for error, burning fuel at unsustainable rates, and separated from any possibility of mutual support with remaining friendly aircraft. The third F-16, flown by Captain Marcus Sledge Johnson, had the advantage of altitude and distance when the ambush began. His initial response was tactically sound: climb for altitude while deploying countermeasures and attempting to identify threats for potential engagement. But Johnson made a critical error that would cost him his life. He tried to execute the original mission instead of immediately departing the target area. "Control, Sledge 3-1," Johnson transmitted as he maneuvered his F-16 into attack position despite the chaos below. "I still have ordnance on board, requesting clearance to engage SAM sites with available weapons." It was a brave decision that demonstrated the aggressive mindset military training tried to instill in combat pilots. But bravery without accurate tactical information often led to heroic deaths rather than mission success. Johnson's F-16 carried air-to-ground missiles optimized for striking buildings and vehicles, not the mobile air defense systems that had already claimed one American fighter and were actively hunting the survivors. Volkov realized she was witnessing the destruction of American air power through a combination of intelligence failure and tactical inflexibility. The mission briefing had emphasized aggressive prosecution of targets, but it had failed to prepare pilots for the possibility that the entire tactical situation might be different from what intelligence suggested. Now 3 highly trained pilots were dying because military bureaucracy had prioritized operational momentum over accurate threat assessment. As she watched Johnson's F-16 maneuver toward what he believed were legitimate targets, Volkov made a decision that would transform her from observer to active participant in the unfolding disaster. She had already violated orders by providing tactical warnings to friendly aircraft. Now, she was about to cross a line that would make her a pariah within the military organization she had served for 8 years. But sometimes, she reflected grimly, loyalty to fellow warriors required betraying the institutions that claimed to represent their interests. Captain Johnson's F-16 never had a chance to engage its intended targets. As he rolled into his attack run, 3 separate missile systems acquired lock on his aircraft simultaneously, a level of coordination that suggested professional military training rather than improvised insurgent tactics. The missiles came from different directions and altitudes, making successful evasion nearly impossible even for a pilot with Johnson's skill level. Volkov watched the converging missile tracks through her targeting system and realized she was about to witness the systematic destruction of American air power by an enemy that intelligence had completely underestimated. More disturbing was the growing certainty that this wasn't an intelligence failure. It was an intelligence deception. Someone had deliberately provided false information that would lead American aircraft into a prepared killing zone. "Sledge 3-1, Reaper 6, she transmitted urgently. "Multiple missiles inbound from your 10, 2, and 6 o'clock positions. Recommend immediate defensive egress." But even as she spoke, she knew Johnson was out of options. The missiles were too close, coming from too many directions, and his aircraft was committed to an attack run that eliminated most evasive maneuvering possibilities. The explosion that destroyed Johnson's F-16 was even more spectacular than Patterson's death, perhaps because his aircraft carried a full load of ordnance that detonated sympathetically when the surface-to-air missile found its target. The fireball illuminated the entire valley, creating a pillar of smoke and flame that would be visible for dozens of kilometers. Another American pilot dead, another $30 million fighter reduced to scattered debris, another family that would receive a folded flag and official condolences. Chen's voice cut through the radio static, tight with stress but maintaining professional composure. "Reaper 6, Phoenix 2-1. I'm Winchester on countermeasures and low on fuel. Request immediate vector for emergency recovery." This was the critical moment when Volkov had to choose between following orders and saving lives. Official mission parameters required her to remain in the target area to provide battle damage assessment and close air support for any potential ground operations. But the tactical situation had deteriorated beyond any possibility of mission success, and keeping Chen's damaged F-16 in the area would likely result in a third American death. Phoenix 2-1, Reaper 6, Volkov transmitted. Follow my aircraft on heading 270 for immediate egress from target area. We're getting you out of here now. She banked her Apache toward the northwest, leading Chen's F-16 away from the killing zone that intelligence had assured them would be lightly defended. The decision was tactically sound, but constituted direct violation of her orders. Mission commanders expected aircraft to remain on station until officially released, regardless of changing tactical conditions. By independently deciding to escort Chen's fighter to safety, Volkov was assuming authority that regulations reserved for officers several ranks above her current position. But as she flew through the mountain valleys, with the sole surviving F-16 tucked in formation behind her, she felt no regret about the choice. "Control, Reaper 6, she transmitted as they cleared the immediate threat area. "Strike package has encountered organized air defense systems not identified in intelligence briefings. 2 F-16s destroyed, 1 damaged and departing area. Mission parameters no longer valid based on actual tactical situation." The response from Mission Control revealed the institutional inflexibility that had created this disaster. "Reaper 6, Control. You are directed to return to target area and complete assigned mission. Phoenix Flight is directed to continue operations as briefed." It was an order that demonstrated complete disconnection from battlefield reality. Control was directing a damaged fighter and a lone attack helicopter to return to an area where sophisticated air defense systems had already destroyed 2 American aircraft. The order would certainly result in additional casualties while achieving no meaningful tactical objectives. It was the kind of decision that looked reasonable on paper, but ignored everything military science had learned about adapting to changing battlefield conditions. Volkov keyed her radio one final time as a member of the United States Army. "Control, Reaper 6. Unable to comply. Tactical situation requires immediate egress and reassessment. Phoenix 2-1 requires emergency landing and maintenance support." With those words, she crossed from military discipline into open rebellion. She was no longer following orders. She was making independent tactical decisions based on her assessment of battlefield conditions. In the rigid hierarchy of military aviation, such independence was tantamount to mutiny, regardless of whether those decisions proved tactically sound. The transformation from loyal officer to military fugitive began with a simple recognition. Sometimes saving lives required disobeying orders, and sometimes institutional loyalty conflicted with loyalty to fellow warriors. As Volkov led Chen's damaged F-16 toward the relative safety of Pakistani airspace, she was already calculating the consequences of her decisions and planning for a future that no longer included service in the United States Army. The emergency landing at a remote Pakistani airstrip marked the end of Captain Zara Volkov's conventional military career and the beginning of something far more complex and dangerous. The airstrip, officially closed and abandoned, had been used for years as a covert refueling point for American aircraft conducting cross-border operations that neither government wanted to acknowledge publicly. Now it would serve as the scene of her final conversation with legitimate military authority. Chen's F-16 had sustained significant battle damage, hydraulic leaks, avionics malfunction, and structural stress that made continued flight inadvisable. As Volkov helped her shut down the damaged fighter, both pilots understood they were participants in a disaster that would have consequences extending far beyond their individual careers. 2 American fighters destroyed, intelligence failures that bordered on criminal negligence, and mission parameters that had ignored tactical reality in favor of operational wishful thinking. "Jesus Christ, Reaper," Chen said as she climbed down from her aircraft, removing her helmet to reveal the strain of the past hour's combat. "What the hell was that? Intelligence said minimal air defenses, maybe some small arms fire. That looked more like they were expecting us. This was the question that had been nagging at Volkov throughout the engagement. The level of coordination she had witnessed wasn't consistent with opportunistic insurgent tactics. The missile systems had been positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Their crews had demonstrated professional-level training and timing. And most troubling of all, they had seemed to know exactly when and where American aircraft would appear. It suggested intelligence penetration or deliberate deception at levels that implied systematic betrayal. "Chen, I think we were set up," Volkov said quietly, checking her watch and calculating how long they had before search and rescue aircraft would arrive to collect them. "Someone wanted those F-16s shot down, and they used us to make it happen." The accusation hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither pilot wanted to fully acknowledge. Military officers were trained to assume competence and good faith from superior authority, even when evidence suggested otherwise. But sometimes evidence became so overwhelming that professional denial became impossible, and both women were reaching that threshold. Chen's response revealed the careful thinking of someone who understood the gravity of what they were discussing. If that's true, then we're not just dealing with mission failure. We're talking about treason at levels that could reach the Pentagon. People with access to mission planning, intelligence assessments, and operational authority. Before Volkov could respond, the distinctive sound of approaching helicopters echoed across the remote airstrip. But instead of the American search and rescue aircraft they expected, the approaching aircraft displayed no national markings and flew in formations that suggested military rather than humanitarian missions. Both women reached for their sidearms simultaneously, recognizing that their situation had just become infinitely more complicated. The lead helicopter touched down 50 meters from their position, and armed men in unmarked uniforms deployed with the precision of professional soldiers. Their equipment was modern and well-maintained, their tactics suggested extensive training, and their weapons were pointed directly at the two American pilots. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to know exactly who they were looking for. "Captain Volkov, Captain Chen," the apparent leader called out in accented but fluent English. "Please step away from your aircraft with your hands visible. We have no intention of harming you, but we require your cooperation." The fact that he knew their names and ranks confirmed Volkov's worst suspicions about intelligence penetration. These weren't random insurgents who had stumbled upon crashed American aircraft. They were professionals conducting a planned operation based on advance information about American flight operations. The implications extended far beyond their immediate predicament into questions about who could be trusted within the American military hierarchy. "Who are you and what do you want?" Volkov called back, her pistol drawn but not yet aimed at any specific target. She was calculating angles and distances, assessing possibilities for resistance or escape, but the tactical situation offered few options. Their aircraft were damaged and low on fuel. They were in hostile territory without support, and they were outnumbered by at least 10 to 1. The leader's response revealed knowledge that chilled both pilots to their core. "Captain, we represent certain interests that have been monitoring your recent activities with great attention. Your refusal to follow orders during today's mission demonstrates exactly the kind of independent thinking we value. We would like to offer you an opportunity to continue serving that cause, albeit in a different capacity." It was recruitment pitch delivered at gunpoint, an offer to join whatever organization had orchestrated the destruction of American aircraft and the apparent compromise of American intelligence systems. The proposal carried obvious attractions for pilots who had just witnessed institutional failures that had killed their colleagues, but it also represented a complete betrayal of everything they had sworn to defend. Chen's response was immediate and unequivocal. "Go to hell. Whatever you're offering, we're not interested." Her voice carried the conviction of someone whose loyalty remained unshaken despite recent disillusionment with military leadership. But Volkov's response was more complex, reflecting the tactical calculations that had defined her approach to every combat situation. Before I tell you to go to hell, I want to know who we represents and what certain interests means. I'm curious about who had enough inside information to set up an ambush that killed 2 American pilots. The leader smiled, recognizing the difference between outright rejection and negotiating position. Captain, those are excellent questions. Perhaps we could discuss them somewhere more comfortable than an abandoned airstrip. Your aircraft are damaged beyond flight capability. Your government will certainly charge you with insubordination and possibly treason.